Andrew Parker Bowles may have stepped away after his marriage to Camilla ended, but his ties to the royal family have never fully disappeared. His family's connection to the Windsors runs deep. His father was a close friend of the Queen Mother, and Andrew himself grew up within those circles. When he and Camilla divorced in 1995, the public accepted the official explanation. They had drifted apart, and Camilla was already moving toward her long-destined relationship with Charles. For years, that version of events went unchallenged. Now, nearly 30 years later, Andrew has broken his silence in a rare private interview that was leaked to the press. Known for his reserve, the former Army officer has chosen to speak out, not out of revenge, but because, as he says, history keeps getting it wrong. He insists he didn't walk away because of Charles, but because of the woman Camilla had become. His words paint a more complicated picture than the familiar love triangle story. He describes not just infidelity, but quiet betrayals, calculated choices, and the transformation of a once carefree and spirited woman into someone he hardly recognized. In his view, Camilla's relationship with Charles wasn't only about romance, it was about what standing next to him could bring her. With Camilla now seated beside the king as queen consort, Andrew's reflections carry new weight. They don't threaten her place on the throne, but they do challenge the carefully shaped narrative the palace has promoted for decades. This story is not just about the end of a marriage. It is about legacy, truth, and the heavy price of ambition within the monarchy. Today, as insiders scramble to contain the fallout and the public watches with fascination, a deeper question lingers. What sacrifices were made on Camilla's path to the throne? Was Andrew Parker Bowles the first to be left behind? Before the royal scandal, Camilla and Andrew were seen as one of Britain's most dazzling couples. They met in the late 1960s, both from privileged backgrounds and shaped by society's expectations. Andrew was everything a young aristocratic officer was supposed to be, handsome, well-connected, and making his mark in the army. Camilla Shand was sharp, engaging, and admired for her wit, natural humor, and unbothered disregard for stiff traditions. At first glance, they seemed perfectly matched. Their families overlapped, they shared a love of horses, and they were often photographed together at polo fields, hunts, and glittering private gatherings. Their names frequently appeared together in society pages, and the press treated them as an ideal pair. Yet beneath the surface, their relationship was far from smooth. Andrew's reputation as a flirt and philanderer was no secret. He carried himself with the easy charm of a man who thrived on attention. Camilla, however, was no passive partner. She understood the unspoken rules of aristocratic relationships. Appearances outweighed emotions, and discretion mattered above all else. But before we continue, we'd love for you to hit the subscribe button if you're enjoying this video. If you just did, we truly appreciate it. Now, let's get back to the main content. What few knew at the time, and perhaps even Andrew underestimated, was that Camilla's heart remained tied to another man, Charles, the Prince of Wales. Their connection, first sparked in the early 1970s, had been brief yet intense, and its shadow lingered over her marriage for years to come. When Charles left for military service, Camilla chose to marry Andrew. To many it seemed practical, perhaps even a calculated decision. Yet as Andrew reflects, Charles was always present. He never really left our marriage, not for a single moment, Andrew insists. From the start, there were clues, letters tucked away and guarded, phone calls taken in hushed tones, doors closed tight. Invitations to Highgrove bore both their names, but Andrew says Camilla always believed they were meant for her alone. Despite that, they built a family. 2 children, Tom and Laura. For a time, Camilla seemed fulfilled, devoted to motherhood, admired as a gracious hostess, and firmly established in country life. Still, Andrew sensed something missing. She was loyal in every conventional sense, he recalls. She raised our children, kept her place in society, never embarrassed me publicly, but there was always a wall between us, and I could never break through. That invisible barrier only grew higher. Their marriage became less about passion and more about form, anchored in tradition, appearances, and routine. They attended the right parties, smiled for the right photographs, spoke the right words. Behind closed doors, though, the silence was heavy. Friends described the union as steady but cool, free of dramatic fights, yet also free of warmth. As Charles's marriage to Diana began to unravel, Camilla's connection to him deepened. Andrew noticed changes. She grew more deliberate, more strategic. Conversations about their children gave way to questions about royal customs and protocol. It wasn't simply that she longed for Charles. Andrew believed she was preparing for a different future, one where she stood beside him. The image of Camilla and Andrew as a flawless society couple was just that, an image. As the press swarmed Charles and Diana, the fractures within her own marriage quietly expanded. "The world believes Charles was the villain in our story," Andrew says. For Andrew, the truth was unavoidable. Camilla had her own plan, and he was no longer part of it. Their union lasted over 20 years, but to him it was never truly a marriage. It was the backdrop to someone else's story. Eventually, Andrew grew weary of being a supporting character. Their friends knew it. Their staff knew it. And Andrew himself could not ignore it. Charles was both absent and ever present in their lives. At dinners, in arguments, even in quiet moments, his shadow lingered. "People assume affairs are just physical," Andrew confided in his now-leaked interview. This wasn't that. It was emotional, strategic, and in many ways, worse. From the very beginning, Andrew sensed that Camilla's bond with Charles had never been severed. Their romance had been interrupted, not erased, by royal disapproval. Charles was sent away for naval service, and by the time he returned, Camilla was engaged to Andrew. The establishment had deemed her unsuitable for the heir to the throne, too seasoned, too outspoken, so she married Andrew, the safe, well-connected army officer. But Charles never faded from the picture. Andrew recalls finding handwritten notes from Charles tucked in Camilla's desk. "They weren't explicit," he said, "but they were the sort of messages no man sends to a friend's wife." At first, he ignored it. Affairs were tolerated in their social world, managed quietly within certain unspoken rules. But as time went on, it became clear this was no passing indulgence. Charles was permanent. Camilla began taking mysterious trips, often under the guise of visiting friends. Invitations to Highgrove arrived more often, some extended only to her. Even the children began to notice, asking, "Where is Mommy going this weekend?" Andrew admitted that betrayal could be endured, but invisibility could not, and invisibility was exactly what he felt. Though whispers persisted for years, the affair was never officially acknowledged. The palace dismissed speculation. The press tiptoed around it, and Andrew remained outwardly composed, constrained by duty and pride. Inside, though, the damage was undeniable. He remembers returning from military assignments to a wife who seemed distracted, detached, almost indifferent to his return. Toward the end, she stopped pretending. She didn't need to. Friends remember dinners where her face lit up at the mention of Charles, yet dimmed instantly when conversation turned to Andrew's career, or even their children. The divide was complete, and the marriage had become little more than a facade. The breaking point arrived with humiliation. In 1993, the infamous Camilla-gate tapes surfaced, exposing an intimate phone call between Prince Charles and Camilla. The nation was stunned. Diana was devastated. And Andrew? "I wasn't surprised," he admitted. "I'd known for years." Hearing the world confirm it, however, was something else entirely. That was when he understood the marriage was truly finished. Even then, Andrew didn't lash out. He didn't seek headlines or stage a dramatic confrontation. Instead, he quietly pulled back, first emotionally, then physically, and eventually through divorce. By that time, he reflected, I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply finished. For years, Andrew had played his parts dutifully. Husband, officer, silent figure in the background. But as Charles and Camilla's relationship moved from whispers to the public stage, Andrew recognized something essential. He had never truly been central to the story. It was that realization, more than the affair itself, that marked the end. By the late 1980s, Andrew had stopped asking questions. He no longer flinched at Charles's name, nor did he expect explanations for Camilla's frequent absences or distracted moods at the dinner table. What he hadn't anticipated was how swiftly Camilla herself began to change. She wasn't the woman I'd married, he later explained. It wasn't just about Charles anymore. It was about power. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Camilla began attending carefully chosen gatherings, ones that included influential aristocrats and royal allies. She cultivated ties not only with old companions, but with former press officers, political figures, and confidants close to the monarchy. She used to mock all of that, protocol, pageantry, the endless social maneuvering, Andrew recalled. But then she started playing the game, and she was good at it. He realized her reinvention aligned with the very public collapse of Charles and Diana's marriage. As Diana drew overwhelming sympathy and admiration, Camilla worked behind the curtain, securing her place and ensuring she wouldn't be erased when the monarchy shifted. The carefree woman who once rolled her eyes at tradition had been replaced by someone determined, polished, and ambitious. What replaced the carefree woman Andrew had once known was a strategist, someone less focused on affection and more on building a legacy. Staff recalled Camilla hosting discreet meetings with figures tied to communications, protocol, and royal affairs. Andrew himself remembered returning from duty to find folders tucked beneath her desk, filled with press clippings, notes, and talking points. She spent hours on the phone, not arranging dinners or social calls, but mapping out timing, appearances, and perception. She wasn't planning gatherings anymore, Andrew reflected. She was planning a future at Charles's side. That was when it hit him. His marriage had become a stepping stone, something necessary for her journey, but no longer essential to her life. A longtime housekeeper who had worked for the family recalled one unsettling encounter. After returning from a private visit to Highgrove, Camilla entered the drawing room, glanced at Andrew, and smirked. "One day this house won't matter. I'll have a better one." He didn't argue. He didn't reply. But the words lingered. They weren't casual. They revealed her mindset. She wasn't dreaming anymore. She was calculating. Life at home grew colder. Camilla spent increasing time in London, mingling with royal aides and those inside the palace orbit. Once warm gatherings turned stiff and performative. Andrew often found himself in the background, more an accessory than a husband. "At some point, she stopped being my wife," he admitted. "She became someone else's partner in ambition." His tone wasn't bitter, just weary, marked by quiet acceptance. The woman he had married seemed consumed by the allure of what love could deliver, rather than love itself. He stayed longer than most would have, out of pride, loyalty, and devotion to their children, but deep down, he knew. Camilla had stopped chasing a man. She had started chasing a crown. By the early 1990s, Andrew had become emotionally detached, husband in name only. The marriage no longer held warmth. Conversations were transactional. Camilla was seldom home, and their children grew up in a house where affection had been replaced with performance. He endured it, convincing himself it was for the sake of duty, appearances, and family. But the final rupture didn't come from Charles. It came from something far more personal. During one of their rare disputes after a trip to Highgrove, Camilla lashed out. In the middle of the argument, she delivered a line that Andrew would never forget. "This marriage was always temporary. You were the bridge, not the destination." Andrew froze, not at the sharpness, but at the unmistakable truth in her words. It wasn't an insult. It was a revelation, a confirmation that he had never been the goal, merely the placeholder. "I gave her everything. My loyalty, my name, my silence," he said. And in that moment, she erased it all. What cut the deepest wasn't the end of the marriage itself. It was the realization that he had never truly been part of her story at all. What followed was even more devastating. Camilla allegedly dismissed their life together, the children, the home, the years they had built, as nothing more than a stepping stone to something greater. "I could have lived with betrayal," Andrew admitted. "I could accept Charles. I could even stomach the public shame. But I could not bear hearing that our family, our children, were only part of her climb towards something bigger." That night, he made his choice. There were no slammed doors, no immediate calls to lawyers. Instead, something inside him shut down. From then on, the marriage was only a formality. Within a year, he had moved into a separate wing of the estate. Months later, the divorce process began. With the scandal of the Camillagate tapes still fresh, the palace urged restraint. There would be no media circus, no mudslinging. "They wanted it clean," Andrew said, "to protect her, to protect Charles, to protect the crown's image." He agreed. His children didn't need to grow up in chaos. On January 11th, 1995, the divorce was finalized. Headlines were muted. The public barely noticed. And Andrew quietly disappeared from the royal narrative as easily as he had once been written into it. Yet his silence wasn't surrender. It was survival. Leaving wasn't weakness, he later reflected. It was the strongest thing I ever did. I walked away from a woman I loved, not because she loved another man, but because she no longer believed in us. He doesn't speak with resentment. He doesn't accuse. But his voice tightens when he recalls that final argument, the moment he realized he had never been her forever, only her meantime. That, more than the affair itself, was what ended their marriage. Afterward, Andrew chose not to speak publicly. He didn't write tell-all books, didn't feed tabloids. Instead, he stepped back with quiet dignity. He had been a witness to one of the most infamous royal scandals of the century, but he refused to become a spectacle. "I wasn't after attention," he said years later. "I just wanted peace." In 1996, he married Rosemary Dickinson, a landscape designer and old friend, in a small, private ceremony. No press, no royal drama. Just a man trying to rebuild something real. He devoted himself to what mattered most: his children, his regiment, and his beloved horses. Friends say he seemed lighter, more himself, free of the constant shadows of palace intrigue. "Life without Camilla wasn't lonely," he told one confidant. "It was authentic." Still, there were scars. Watching her re-emerge into the spotlight, first as Charles's companion, then as his wife, and finally as queen, stirred a strange mix of detachment and disbelief. "I hardly recognized her," he admitted. "The woman I married was witty, warm, irreverent. What I saw on that Buckingham Palace balcony was someone else. Regal, polished, crowned. She got what she wanted, but not necessarily what she needed." Though he insists he holds no bitterness, there is a faint sadness when he reflects on the past. He spoke fondly of Diana, whom he met several times. "She wasn't hysterical," he said softly. "She was grieving for a man she never truly had. I understood her. I'd already lived that same story." When asked if he regretted marrying Camilla, Andrew paused. "No," he answered. "We had good years. We had 2 wonderful children. But I regret not leaving sooner, regret not seeing the moment when I stopped being her partner and became a placeholder." Now, in his later years, Andrew has become something of a quiet figure of respect in royal circles. The man who could have sold his story, but never did. The ex-husband who had every reason to be bitter, but chose dignity instead. On rare occasions, he still attends royal events, never in the front, always a few rows back, a silent observer to the institution that reshaped his life. Andrew maintained a polite relationship with Charles and even attended his wedding to Camilla in 2005. That was the last page, he reflected, the close of a book I'd already finished. For him, life beyond Camilla became a chance to rediscover who he was without the weight of palace politics. And while the public often cast him as the man she left behind, the reality was far more complex. Sometimes the most powerful choice is to walk away from the person everyone assumed you'd cling to forever. For decades, Andrew's name lingered only at the edges of royal history, mentioned in passing, remembered as the husband quietly replaced by a future king. But after 30 years of silence, his words have shifted the narrative. The world had always assumed he left because of an affair, because Charles had overshadowed him in a love story that stretched across decades. Andrew's truth is quieter, and in many ways, more devastating. It wasn't Charles, he explained. It was Camilla. She became the woman she is now. She chose that life over ours. His reflections dismantle the fairy tale, pulling back the curtain to reveal ambition woven beneath affection. They remind us that every royal headline carries a human cost. Andrew was a man who endured the slow disintegration of his marriage, not with public drama, but with silence. Camilla's ascent has been remarkable, mistress to queen consort, but Andrew's perspective highlights what was left behind: a husband, a family home, and a version of her untouched by power. For Charles, this may remain a quiet shadow, a reminder that the love he held on to came with its own price. For William and Kate, it is a cautionary tale, a lesson in how fragile the monarchy's image can be. And for the public, it is a glimpse beyond the carefully staged smiles and glittering banquets into something more raw. Not every crown is earned with grace. Not every love story concludes with love. Andrew never chased the spotlight. He never wrote the books, never sold his story. But with a few carefully chosen words, he has reshaped one of the most famous royal sagas of modern times. In the end, it wasn't betrayal that destroyed the marriage. It was being forgotten inside it. And now, at last, his voice has been heard.